Anyway, I think we need to try to re-inculcate a different culture of policing that's less focused on junk policing. I think the Europeans might be doing better slightly on this. They've never had a war on drugs in the same way. They seem to be locking up a lot more people in their war on terrorism, and a lot of people who look much more like terrorists than some of the folks that we've been dealing with. Let me turn to the war on terror. I bet I didn't need to put this picture up there. Most of you can close your eyes and see this scene. This will be one of the defining events for our generation, no question about it. Again, I think the war on crime is very important to keep in mind here. What I see is the grave danger that the war on crime is really shaping how we are responding to terrorism. There's a kind of path dependency. The political leaders that have been in charge in the beginning of the war on terror are political leaders shaped by the war on crime. And the law enforcement apparatus, likewise, has been shaped by the war on crime. Now, I think, and we can get into this in the Q&A, I think the war on crime is one of the reasons we didn't find these bastards before they blew up the building. That is, we had lots of evidence that they were around the country, but we just weren't that concerned about them. The New York police were more worried about squeegee men. They were more worried about kids opening beer bottles on Washington Square. It was broken windows policing. It was round up the low-level people and eventually crime will fall. We certainly weren't worried about people like this. Indeed, from the point of view of how we normally think about crime risk, they were not high-risk people. They didn't come from broken homes. They didn't use drugs. They weren't irreligious. They were deeply religious. And I can give you some specific instances where we clearly should have gotten them, but failed to. Well, what about now? It seems to me, if you look at how the war on terror is being perpetuated, it's also a mass imprisonment style. The New York Times the other day just reported on how Baghdad's jails and prisons are now overcrowded with the riffraff rounded up by the surge we've got going in Baghdad. We filled Guantanamo with what are reputedly scores of pretty low-level folks, although we've recently added some real terrorists to the bunch to make sure that, that people think a bit better about Guantanamo. But I think it's a really, the same strategy that we can win this war by simply locking up enough of them for long enough is at work, and it's dangerously misguided in the war on terror. Finally, I think it's encouraged a high-tech, sometimes high-tech, but really mass surveillance style, right? In the war on drugs, again, you don't need to do detailed, specific investigation. You kind of round up the suspects, or you use surveillance techniques to maintain and monitor lots of people. And again, we see this in the war on terror. I think we need more people like Doug Evans developing reasonable suspicion on the ground in the war on terror. I'm not sure we have them yet. Let me turn to one final example before I close, because I want to come back to Katrina. What is the takeaway message for the future disaster preparedness of America from Hurricane Katrina? Well, I would put it to you that notwithstanding the fact that virtually every newspaper in the country covered the fact that the crime flap was really wrong, that much like the weapons of mass destruction or Saddam's connections to al-Qaeda, more people will have read the first story than the correction, and that many people will continue to believe that what the real lesson of Katrina is boots on the ground, stop the looting, emphasize law and order, and that is the lesson that people will take away as they begin to prepare for the next disaster. Now, I think this is a disturbing possibility. First of all, when we focus on crime, and we saw this in Katrina, all of us, when we're put in that posture, think about crime, tend to be more willing to believe the worst about other people when crime is the frame, and likewise less willing to invest in things that help collectivities of people. It's a kind of a cynicism that crime brings. You don't trust people. What were the two consumer products that went up in sales most rapidly after 9/11? Does anyone know? Yeah. That's not a bad one. That would be a good one to have. What I heard was handguns and SUVs. Right, now, at least gas masks, I can see the logic. I'm not sure what you would do with a handgun in 911. You know, draw a bead on the plane as it's coming in, or would you run down and hide in your Nissan Armada in the parking lot? I just don't think those are very helpful strategies, but what they reflect is this kind of fortress mentality that the war on crime has encouraged. Distance yourself, be prepared to defend yourself, don't trust other people, don't trust the infrastructure or the system. Another feature of this is that crime, and this is a very interesting phenomenon that I'm just beginning to study, crime risk is deemed so serious that when people abandon their usual roles in the face of crime risk, that's not viewed as dishonorable, right? We tend to applaud bravery, but when it comes to crime risk, we're not the land of the free and the home of the brave. We tend to be lock them up and we're scared. One just tiny incident of this. I heard this on NPR, and you can actually hear it, it's archived. In the midst of the hurricane aftermath, NPR did a story where they interviewed the people in the aquarium, who were running the aquarium in New Orleans. And the story was all about how they went through the storm, even though it was supposed to be a killer storm. They didn't want to abandon their animals. They stayed as it looked like the city might be inundated with floods. But when the looting and the murder and the rape was reported, their bosses told them to go home, and they left. All of them left the aquarium. And the reporter, there's kind of a long silence, and the reporter says, well, what happened to the fish? They died. Now, my only point is not that they were wrong to leave the fish and go protect their families. My point is simply that they were willing to face the storm. They were willing to face the flood. Leaving in the front of those enemies would have been considered somehow dishonorable to their own sense of identity as aquarium workers. But when it comes to crime, it's sort of all of that drops away, and we're permitted to say, protect me, get me out of here, beam me up, I don't want to be part of this. Now, what I want to suggest is that as we look at the next Katrina, and it might be in my home, the Bay Area, where a giant earthquake has long been expected to be the next major catastrophe. It could happen anywhere along the Gulf Coast with hurricanes, quite obviously. With global warming, who knows what kind of combination of natural problems might arise. Clearly, part of what safety in the future and justice as well has got to be about is helping people prepare for that. And my biggest fear is that as people take away the lessons of Katrina, preparing for the next disaster, they are going to be buy a gun, be prepared to defend your own house, don't trust systems. I think one of the things you find if you study real disasters in real time is that there's a huge amount of pro-social activity that goes on. People rescue each other. People who aren't tasked to do that rescue each other. People often find the best of themselves in those circumstances. But if they believe that they have to protect their family first or themselves, a lot of that pro-social behavior goes away. Let me give you one final concrete example. I went to a fire earthquake preparedness meeting in Berkeley, right, radical Berkeley, in my own neighborhood to meet with some of my neighbors and a member of the Berkeley Fire Department to talk about the earthquake. Well, we talked a bit about the earthquake and fire. We talked about storing food and water. But I swear, half of the hour-long session was spent talking about looting. There'll be looters up here. And what did the firefighter want us to think about preparing for? Close down your street. You got to have block off both sides of your block with cars so that looters won't be able to get on there. And when one of my neighbors raised her hand and said, you know, I've got an elderly friend who lives about half a mile away in Kensington, and I'm very worried about how will I get to her and be able to help her if there are all these barricades up. She was essentially castigated by this firefighter who told her, your business is defending your block with your neighbors. Don't worry about those other people in your social network. So I'm very concerned that this kind of crime model of risk can lead to really anomic behavior, not pro-social behavior, lead people to not trust in larger social systems, to not invest in infrastructure like better dikes, environmental restoration, other kinds of grand-scale fixes that would be very expensive and necessary. Well, let me close. People demand both justice and safety. That's not going to change in our lifetimes. I think we're in for a long period of this. Nor can we just reassure people that they should go back and just rely on insurance and other sort of age of solidarity models of security. In the face of catastrophes like Katrina, like nuclear disasters, people want both justice, they want accountability, and they want safety. They want to know that precautions are being taken, all the precautions necessary. I believe I've tried to lay out for you a profile of why I think the war on crime and the kind of governing through crime that's come out of that has been disastrous for preparing for that mission. It's up to you, I'm afraid, as the next generation of Americans concerned about justice and safety to lead our country into a better resolution of these dilemmas. And I'll look forward to your discussion. Thank you.